Becomes like a fleeting memory. Whatever you grab just turns to dust. Like eye contact with a stranger in a crowded room. It's a dream that you feel.
Meditation
Past
time.
the note of a song.
Just a quick meditation to the shores. Okay.
Good.
I'm good. Are you good?
I don't
How
know.
are you?
I'm on the shores.
To the shores.
To the shores. Well, welcome everybody. We're here. We're doing it. We got our fancy new Shores of Ignorance. What I don't even know what you call that.
Logo up on the wall. Yeah. So if you're just listening, check out the video.
Yeah.
You can watch it on Spotify or YouTube, and we got our logo up. It's kind of fun. Feels very official.
I know. I feel like we're growing up so much in the last 3 months.
Totally.
Yeah. But
well, we're on the back half of life.
Mm-hmm.
We both lost our father in the last year.
Yeah.
We got to grow up finally.
Sometime. I mean, I think that's something I was thinking about this week was just like, what am I doing with my life? Kind of like one of those types of questions.
So what are you doing with your life?
Well, I think I answer that question differently at different stages of my life. And I think there's a part too of losing and discovering things that were important to you that you've kind of lost, and kind of discovering them again almost for the first time, but in a new way, because you're not that same person that you had those maybe aspirations beforehand.
Yeah, as you said that I totally had that experience recently.
Oh, yeah.
But why don't you start? What did you lose and then recover?
Well, I think it was kind of during the pandemic that I think kind of like squashed it out of me. Just kind of, you don't like not having people to talk to or interact with, and you're trying to have as least amount of contact with as many people as you can.
Right.
And it just seemed like that was just sort of the way things went. And, people also you didn't know exactly where people stood, and you're super hyper aware of how people felt about, the situations, whether it's, George
like social
Floyd,
situations,
social situations, distancing, partying, how you're going to interact and what people are comfortable with. And something that I saw that I lost this last week was there was something I really enjoyed doing, and something that through the coffee shop specifically is, like, for me, there's this little spark that everybody has, and it's finding that little spark. And sometimes it's from the wear of tear of day, or just the troubles of life, or whatever it is, or some people just are very cantankerous in general. But I always enjoyed finding that little spark, and then when you put your finger on that little spark, they just come alive, And that was something that I always enjoyed, kind of finding that in each person.
You are really good at that.
Yeah.
In social situations.
Yeah.
As much as I know you hate social situations, you can talk to anybody and find the thing that makes them want to talk.
Yeah.
That makes them come alive. It's really a beautiful thing to watch.
That's cool.
I'm not very good at it.
Yeah.
I have noticed that about you over the years, though, and tried to learn from your ways and emulate you.
My Padawan, come.
It's the way you put that the pandemic squashed it out of you. Mm-hmm. I feel like those first really 2 years, 2020 and 2021, squashed a lot out of a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it did feel like that, like a squashing. Mm-hmm. Like the whole thing had a weight to it that was just bearing down on you.
Yeah.
It was social, it was health related, it was fear related, it was economic, it was some of your favorite businesses closing, some of your favorite people maybe dying or not coming to visit, and the humanity was squashed out of us.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, seeing how that time was different for different people, because I also saw a lot of people looking at their future and asking, what do I want of that? And a lot of people made decisions to change gears and head a different direction. I lost a lot of people in that same way, going back to school or switching careers completely out of coffee. And there was a lot of, I think, soul searching. But for me, it was mostly staying alive, keeping the business thriving, taking care of people. And I didn't have a lot of time to reflect on, what does the future look like, when I was just trying to keep everything together as is and take care of all these people. And I didn't have time to really reflect. And so I kind of feel, and it might have been more so with your dad passing, that listening back on, what your dad said during our interview, your dad always had a great way of kind of listening and pulling things out of you. Yeah. And I think that was kind of a little bit of a trigger for me the last couple of weeks, kind of like, all right, well, what do I want? What do I want this next, 20, 30 years or 5 years to look like? So that was kind of the questions I had.
I think it's interesting that you said that during those years of the pandemic, you didn't have as much time to reflect, which is maybe counterintuitive because we were locked down, right? Like we were spending a lot more time at home, a lot less time out doing things, which would make you think that you would have more time to reflect. But maybe reflection actually requires, to have time to reflect, requires that you spend time out in the world doing something so that you have something to reflect on. And maybe another reason for feeling like you couldn't reflect during those years is just a sense of, well, it isn't there's not much of a point in thinking about or planning for the future when the next week is completely unknown. There's no stability,
Yeah.
Don't know if we're going to go out of business. Don't know if lockdown's going to end. Don't know if we're going to be safe from COVID. So you just you're very myopic in your thinking. And so you're not reflecting.
Yeah.
Because there's not much to reflect on.
No, I mean, that's very true. And I also kind of just realized this too, whenever I was playing softball with my oldest daughters. It was her last game of her senior year, and it's super fun. The other team didn't show up, so we went out there. The parents went out there and played the kids. And I forget about that. Like getting out of your normal makes things new. Like you get a new perspective. They always say that, if you get stuck, go for a run, and that kind of things. But there's something about getting out of your normal, which I have such sort of rigid things I do. And it's just really healthy for me to get out of my normal. And
that's a beautiful observation to be confronted with the unknowns that happen in life. Like, oh, we're going to go play this baseball game. The other team doesn't show up for some reason or another. And then to respond to that situation, to say, well, what if the parents play?
It's super fun.
If you never planned to play the baseball game in the first place, you don't ever reach the point of that unknown that calls you to respond to it. And that's like an act of creativity and that's an act of humanity, is to respond to what calls. Yeah.
It's the same thing with travel too. It puts you in a different environment, a different place that you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing, where you're going, and you don't really know what's going to happen the next day because it's unfamiliar. And that's something that I think helps, when we used to go to marathon, or we just didn't do it this year, but there's something about getting out of our normal that kind of opens up new insights and a time to reflect, or because you're not bogged down from the things that are always around you, the reminders of responsibility. And
we'll have to resume our Shores of Ignorance yearly trip.
I know.
For that reason. When you talked about travel, and this whole thing made me think about something that I was reflecting on last night. Just it's been 3 weeks since my father passed away, and the world feels like a different place to me. And I started having this thought, and I'll just see if I can work it out with you, which is everything seems somehow more meaningful. And that's not the right word, but it's a good starting place. The feeling reminded me of when I used to go to summer camp in like junior high. First couple of years I went away to summer camp, I was alone or on my own, couldn't really call mom and dad. We would write letters. but I had to make sense of things for myself. I had to make decisions for myself. I had to go interact with people, strangers, both adults and kids, and decide how to navigate that, and then come home or back to the cabin and sleep on it, and wake up and think, how do I want to be today?
Yeah.
Which is a contrast to the way that you are when you're growing up in your parents' house, because your life is sort of inside of theirs, and they're speaking into it and reflecting on it with you and guiding you, giving advice, giving feedback all of the time. Like, don't do that. Don't hit your sister, or
don't get that tattoo.
You really need to clean up your clothes before you go to bed, something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a meaning-making mechanism in that that I think you take for granted in a certain way until you're outside of it. It's the same with travel. There's so many things in your life you take for granted until you go travel, and everything's new and everything's different.
Especially a foreign country. Just going to the grocery store is a huge adventure.
Yeah.
Oh, they call that smør here.
And it means
butter,
it means something to go to the grocery store when you're in Paris. Whereas you go to the grocery store in your hometown in Austin, that's an errand.
Yeah.
But when you go in a foreign country, it's more of an adventure. It means more somehow. And there's some feeling that's akin to that in me, which is that I'm at summer camp now. I can't call my dad. I can't work through things with him. Can't ask him for his advice. I've got to make my decisions, and they're mine. And suddenly everything is brighter. I don't mean better. I mean, I see more because I'm constantly aware of okay, I've got to move through this, whether it's a conversation with one of my kids or a problem up at the school with them, or something at work, or something in relationship that I would always talk through with my dad before making any serious moves. And now I just have to navigate that. And so everything is sort of hyper in focus, and I'm hyper vigilant to the way that I'm thinking about things and the way that I'm interacting with things, because I kind of have to get it right. Or the meaning-making structure, the mattering structure, of which my dad was a part, has changed. It's changed structure underneath me.
Let me ask you this question. You might not be able to answer this right now, but it would be interesting to get your thoughts on even after this. But because as you were saying that, I kind of started seeing different moments in life. So you left home to go to college. You've talked about a little bit that on the pod. But then you also left your parents and got married and had a kid.
Yeah.
And then you also lived in Austin away from them. And there's certain parts that you're kind of defining your own life and your own rhythms and your own ways, and I'm sure there's some other ones in between that. But then I think another huge thing would be the loss of your parent. And you can kind of see, I would say, what in any one of those instances, did you ever feel a shift? I kind of, the word I want to throw in here is I became a man when, and that might not be the right word.
No, well, I was going to say that actually, because I don't remember if I said it this way on last week's episode, where we really kind of focused on the passing of my father, but it seems this might be too simplistic to choose just two instances, but it seems like the second of the two biggest events that will happen in my life. The first being the birth of my son.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
The second being the death of my father. I feel like the birth of my son made me a father. The death of my father made me a man.
Yeah, it's sort of almost the cliche, the head of the house now, or there's a certain changing of the guard too, as far as who's kind of leading the McCloskey clan into the future kind of thing, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the oldest or, you know, I think, but hitting that space where now you are the elders,
Right.
You know, obviously your mom's still with us and she's part of that elder, but there's that losing one or the other parent kind of like, you start to almost see that transition. Cause I was also thinking about, I mean, Allison's going to outlive me. So that's pretty much, everybody in her family's like 92 and 100,000, something like that.
100,000.
Oh yeah. They're old. But I was also thinking about older people that are like in their late 90s and everybody has died except for them. And what that would feel like, you know, that sort of my whole circle that I've sort of walked through life with has passed away. And that's a whole nother stage of life. We don't have to worry about that right now, but
No, I think that would be really hard. I mean, there is some amount of paradox in me or conflict in me about when I would like to die.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, you know, I don't really want to die. So part of me thinks, you know, I want to live into my 90s. And then another part of me thinks that sounds horrific and exhausting and full of so much loss and degradation of body. And I don't want it, you know?
But at what point, maybe you can't answer this, but is there sort of a line in the sand that you draw as far as, I don't want to be dead. I don't want to be alive if I'm like this.
I think really the only thing that I'm concerned about losing is my cognitive faculties. If those start to go, I can't imagine enjoying that. But then again, if they're going, are you really even aware of it? And watching some of my grandparents decline into dementia and Alzheimer's, that was so terribly difficult on those of us taking care of them. That's hard.
Yeah, that's kind of one thing with my dad. He died at 75, and a part of me was very thankful in a sense. I mean, I wish there would have been more years, but also that it wasn't a 5 to 7 years of dementia. Like I know my dad would not have liked that.
Yeah.
And to even have, I mean, I think there's a certain amount as you get older, you need to accept the help of your children. And that's something that it's a humbling thing that I think is necessary as you get older. But I know my dad would not have wanted to burden us with something like that.
Right.
And so part of me is thankful, you know, it went as fast as it did for him at the very end, you know, but.
Yeah, I have that feeling about my dad too. You know, for him, it was instant. No one saw it coming. And I was really upset about that at first. And then I thought, you know, there's another way to look at that, which is that, as you said, I wish I had more years, but I'm glad that he was happy and healthy to the moment that he left, and that there wasn't some period of time in which he wasn't happy and healthy. And there's something of a blessing in that. I was talking to my dad's friend, Tom, and he called it a severe mercy. It's really hard, but there's also a mercy in it. And I feel at least somewhat thankful for that.
It's so hard to talk about it like in these sort of terms, because, you know, the question is, without a doubt, would you like to have had more years? The answer is yes.
Yes. And there's no scenario in which I would not say yes to that. At least with, you know,
outside suffering or whatever.
My parents. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want all the years with them I can get.
Yeah.
And I got 40 with my dad, and I feel kind of robbed, but those were good years. And 40's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really. Does losing your, this might be too soon too, but does losing your dad make you think of death any differently, or have you just your own sort of like grappling and with what that means, and that your time here? Obviously, this might be too soon of a question, so
I think it might be for me to give much of an answer to that. No, I don't think I have thought too much about that. I think I've mostly just been living a bit in the past, just thinking of memories of my dad, and still somewhat in shock that this current reality is actual reality.
Yeah. Sometimes I ask the questions too soon.
It's okay. You can ask me any questions you want.
Yeah.
So all of that was something of a response to, here we are on this precipice, looking at a new stage in life. And you were starting to ask yourself, well, what am I doing and what do I want? Where do I want to go? Maybe instead of me asking you what the answer to that question is, I'd like to know, how do you approach a question like that? How do you grapple it? How do you make work of it in order to come by an answer?
That's a very, very good question. It kind of is in two different spaces. One is sort of a kind of an awareness of, or trying to understand what I want, whether it's good or bad, or what I think I want. I think those are some of the things I've kind of been working through. And it's interesting as I keep going through the things I want. And again, this is within the last 2 weeks with your dad passing, but that part with everything is relational and personal. And then I kept coming to these things that I wanted. And I was like, but what for? Like, I would like to make more money, but what for? And it was interesting that most of the time when I chased those answers down, it was a relational aspect. Like, I would love to be able to take my kids and have travel with them and have moments with them and show them, and teach them things that I have gotten to, had the privilege to be able to experience and know, and to pass that on to them. And it also made me a little bit sad that, with Elia just starting our own business and many, many years of just struggle. I can just see her kind of missing out on some of the benefits of our latter years of maybe even having a little bit more financial ability to do those things.
Ellie is your oldest.
Ellie is my oldest,
Yeah,
and she's
just for the
graduating this year.
listeners.
She's an amazing human being. But to really get into that question, it becomes more religious for me, honestly. And I say that in a loose term. That might not be the right word for it, but the reason I say it that way is it's like religious language starts to kind of come into it. You can maybe say it's spiritual or ethereal, just because there's something that you're trying to grab onto that it's not necessarily logical. What do you want in life? Where do you want to be? It's not something like, well, I'd like to achieve these goals. It's like, but what for and why?
Yeah.
And so I don't know if I'm prepared to go all the way into that, but those are two things that kind of stood out to me. Is whenever I'm starting to get engaged in this type of inquiry, I kind of automatically almost start praying, if that makes sense. Not in a traditional sense maybe, but that's the only word I could really say, is because I'm not looking for an answer. It's like, it's more of a something that's a little bit more it's sort of like a nudging or an intuition that you sort of start to kind of build into you, and then it fleshes out into something. But you're looking for something that's kind of bubbling up, like a vapor, or you start whiffing something, and then you start moving towards it. And I find that the way that I get to that space is more through what I would say traditionally we call prayer, or openness to other, and openness to God, or however you want to say that. There's something that I've found over the years that opening yourself up to that kind of helps you get a better understanding of that sort of what you want, because it's not money, it's not a bigger house, it's not a car. There's all these things, but it's what for. So I don't know.
So
That's pretty
maybe,
vague.
well, maybe part of the answer to what you're describing as religious language is like a very simple exercise that you can do, which is that you can ask yourself a question, like, what do you want? And sort of legitimately not know the answer. And all contained within yourself, at least is how you experience it maybe, you can answer yourself. Or you could sit down and ask yourself, what am I doing wrong in my life? That if I changed, my life would get better. And yourself can answer that. And it isn't like you already know the answer. It's almost like there's two parts of you. You can have a conversation with yourself. And what do you do with that? So when you're praying, it's sort of like that, but your attention is not simply on yourself, but on something else. I mean, there's something going on that's at work there. And I think that's when you start to need something like religious language, something like prayer. We've talked about this before, but an exercise I like to do is to write a conversation down and assign the other person in the conversation a symbol. So I'll write Matt, and then I'll begin a conversation. And I'm not saying I'm inventing a conversation like I'm writing a piece of fiction. I'm asking questions that I legitimately want to know the answers to. And those become some of the most moving and productive pieces of writing that I do in my journal. So what is that? Am I praying? Is that God responding to me? Is there some part of me that I don't understand that exists in some spiritual place that I don't have full-time access to? Whatever the answers to those are, I think that the empirical, experiential evidence for the existence of that, to me, seems undeniable. And as you were talking about, the conversation you're having internally about what you want and what you want for the future is something like prayer. And I was thinking something you and I we did once was we were just sitting out on the back patio post podcast one night, I think, and we sort of imagined that our like 90-year-olds or 80-year-old selves were sitting across from us, and we sort of had this conversation with them. And I think, well, what is that? You don't know your 80-year-old self, but you know something of him, and you understand the direction that you're moving and the places you hope to be. And you can have a conversation with your older self, and that can be productive. And then I was thinking, so I shared this clip with you, somebody on Instagram or something, talking about how every person has two parents without fail, right? And each of your two parents has two parents, so you have four grandparents, and each of them have two parents, so you have 8 great-grandparents. If you go back 10 generations, there were 4,000 people involved in bringing you into existence. Just 10 generations.
Yeah.
And can you imagine, like, you have kids, you have all these hopes, fears, desires, longings. What is the collective hope and the collective fear of 4,000 people for their offspring hanging over you? What is that? And that seems, well, something like a spirit. Like, what is the spirit of all of those people and all of that procreation that led down to a single point, which is you? And could you talk to it?
That's probably part of the first religious aspects were, talking to your ancestors was a very primal
religion. It's depicted in what would you say?
Many
stories.
Books, Iliad.
All the time.
Yeah.
I mean, even as recently as the movie Avatar.
Well, there's something that I think that's where you get to the sort of prayer or having a conversation with God is sort of, if you extrapolate all those types of ideas into one thing, that's where you have God. But again, it's like there's something about talking to your ancestors, like so your dad's passed away. There's something about having a conversation with him, even though he has passed on, that's still like it opens something else in you, because there's a sort of honesty you have because you know your father knows you, And so you cannot lie to your dad because your dad will know that you're lying to him. So there's a certain honesty you have when you talk to your ancestors that that is embedded in the conversation, where like, you know, like if I died and you were having a conversation with me, it would be different because I don't know you in the same way that your dad knew you. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I mean, that, so then you kind of extrapolate these ideas when you think of like a God who knows you completely and loves you and whatever the tenets that you might believe in that. But there's sort of like you're opening yourself and laying yourself bare, and there's a certain honesty and truth that sort of inhabits that space, where if you were to have a conversation with, I just pick a random person, Sam, you're like, hey, Sam, you have no relational aspect to that person. So that there's a very low level of vulnerability and truth.
Seems
that
like
comes
a really
out of it.
similar statement to what we were saying earlier about like you couldn't reflect during the pandemic. And maybe part of that is, well, you weren't out in the world being relational. It takes, you have to be in relationship to reflect. There isn't anything else to reflect on really, except for relationship. And so if you don't know someone, you're not going to strike up a conversation about and like have a productive conversation about answering the question, what do I want for my future? Because Sam doesn't know you.
Yeah.
And you would have a very different conversation about that with me than you would with Allison, your wife, and a very different conversation than you would have with Elia or your youngest, Hazel. But those conversations are predicated on the relationship.
Yeah.
And just talking to a stranger is a much different thing.
It's super fascinating. I would love to be able to unpack this more. I feel like I'm just kind of stumbling around a little bit in this area, but it does, like what you're saying, the whole relational aspect and being able to, like, how that draws something out of you. And I think we talked about it a couple times where maybe it was a couple episodes back, but just even the idea of truth, when you're seeking after truth, it's like there's a sort of, if falsehood comes in, it's something that you almost have to willingly sell yourself to it, if that makes sense. Like, so if you're, well, I've always, again, this is one of those, it's kind of more of a metaphor, but it's like when you try honey for the first time, you're like, whoa, that's so sweet. And then someone gives you something that's not honey. They're like, hey, this is honey. You're like, no, that's not honey. And you go years without it, but you know it's something that the taste, and it really kind of opened your eyes. And then you come across something, you're like, oh, that's it. Whatever that was, what was that you just gave me? And it kind of like, I kind of see the same thing about truth, is that same sort of, once you taste it. And it's also whenever in a relationship, when you're in a relationship with people or someone who knows you really well, you know what that closeness of relationship is, and then you start to measure other relationships.
And you're not really fooled by any counterfeits.
And they say that a lot about, specifically with women, with men, is if daughters have good relationships with their fathers, they can kind of spot men that are predatory or have false motives a lot better, because they know what it is to be loved and cared for, and it's like very healthy and useful.
They know what it is to be loved. They couldn't tell you, but they could tell you when someone's not doing it. So much of what we know, we can't articulate. And I think in modern post-Enlightenment intellectual land, and this is Ian McGilchrist's whole thesis, right? Like, we have this arrogance, this left brain arrogance that thinks that we know what we know, and we know how to articulate it. And that's not true at all.
It's so not true. And it even comes into the whole idea of like procedural, episodic, and semantic memory. So, semantic memory is more of our philosophical language, scientific language, how we engage with rationality. But that's such like it's so up here. And, then you have episodic, which is more like story oriented, your myths, your religion, and that kind of stuff. And your procedural memory is almost more like lizard brain type of stuff.
Like how to ride a bike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's so much more hidden and deeper in this episodic and the procedural memory. Semantic memory is just surface.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people have been able to dive in and be able to extrapolate some really amazing nuggets that are then able to communicate it. But so much of I think even Dad talked about, was so much of our life is below the waterline.
Yeah.
We don't even know what's in there until somebody calls it out of us, or a situation we're put in that kind of we rise to the occasion.
Well, it's part of the analogy of our show too.
True.
The shores of ignorance. The water represents what you don't know, and everything that you don't know is under that surface. And learning it can be a dangerous encounter. You can drown, but you can enter those waters. You can try.
Well, even kind of coming back to the idea of prayer. Like I see prayer as a sort of a movement into the unknown, into those waters, and sort of extrapolating something known out of that space. And it's almost as if it kind of reveals, people even talk about this in meditation too, is when you kind of like move into that sort of unknown space and allow some of the baggage to kind of come off of you, new things sort of reveal themselves to you. But it's like making the space. And also there's a little bit of humility and submission to the unknown. And I think without submission to the unknown, there's not a lot that you...
What does that mean, submission to the unknown?
It's sort of an acknowledgement that I don't know as I should know.
Sounds like humility.
Humility, and also even a confession, that... I think even like, it's even a confession as far as I've been acting in the world in such a way, I do not know any different. Show me how I fall short. There's that kind of a confession of I fall short. Again, I think that's why it's hard for me when I move into this area. It's hard not to use religious language because you're going below the waterline. You're moving into the episodic, into the procedural, and trying to bring it into that semantic memory in order to then to communicate what you sort of drew out of the well. But it's somehow that you have to open yourself up to that more ethereal space, whether you're on the shores looking out onto the ocean and the chaos and the unknown.
I was trying to find something that I wrote. I don't know that I can do this justice, but you used that word confession. Would you say you confess to the unknown? You confess to what you don't know? You confess that it exists? Something I wrote, and it was part of just a little poem almost, is confession requires a choice to no longer be alone. And there's something that's on your heart or your mind. It could be guilt. It could be love or crush. It could be all kinds of things, right? And sometimes it screams at you. And you don't want to share it because maybe you don't want it to be true. You don't want it to be real. But to confess it is to no longer be alone with that. And that struck me as such a beautiful idea.
Well, confession requires at least two.
Yeah.
The confessor and the confessee. And you know, even whether you're shouting it out into the universe, you know, there's something about that verbal exercise or ritual that does help kind of move you into a different space.
Yeah. Well, again, it's relational.
Mm-hmm.
To move into a different space, you have to relate with someone else. And that might be a person. Well, so I think it's always a person. It might be a living person, or it might be someone who's gone, might be God.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires confession, and it requires relationship.
See, it's super interesting when I get to this space, because like I think I don't probably talk about this in this way as publicly. You know, more of the prayer and the God stuff, because I kind of tend to be I like to be more in the semantical, being able to explain things. You know, as far as like, well, hey, here's an exercise. You know, have a conversation with yourself and write it down. You know. It's like there's something you can do, and this, therefore this. But when you kind of take it to the next step, like you were saying, is like I'm doing this exercise, but it's actually making me aware of something outside of this exercise. There's like again, for lack of a better word, a spirit that I'm accessing. Is that spirit inside me, or is this my subconscious somewhere? But you're kind of starting to acknowledge it's not just about doing the exercise. You know, that is creating something. And maybe that's too woo-woo, I don't know, but I tend to think you have to kind of go into the woo-woo a little bit to be able to access the unknown, because if you start to put too many parameters around what is real and what is not real in order to gain understanding, then I find that you limit yourself drastically, because you're basically declaring that you know what's best and you know what is real. Mm-hmm. And there's something about whenever you step into the unknown, you're kind of, you actually are confessing is like, I don't know what's real. I don't know what I'm stepping into. You know, even like someone who's sort of saying, well, we're just animals, we're just meat, chemistry, and we do these things. You know, obviously that's a way simplified answer. It's like, okay, have fun with that. Yeah. But for me, I found that there's a whole nother level to this, and whether I'm fooling myself, that's something else. But I find something meaningful in saying I don't really know what is real. But when we come back to the whole thing,
when you say what is real, are you thinking of something like God? Like, is God real? And you're saying that kind of thing. You're like, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, this is a really good point to clarify, and it's something that you and I have talked about a lot, I think, on this podcast. But there's kind of this paradox of I know who I am, and I also don't know who I am. Mm-hmm. And I find, and it's a paradox, and you have to kind of be in that in between space as far as like, and sometimes you're more in like, okay, I know who I am. And there's this comfortable and confident aspect of that too. And so, but when you're starting to talk about the future and the things you don't know, you start to have to kind of acknowledge and move into, I don't know who I am. That's sort of like that swing. And I think there's this vulnerability and sort of like the city walls and the city that you've built. Everything starts to kind of come into question. And why did I build it this way? Is this wall really necessary here? And you start to go out into the wilderness, into the wild, where you don't have the protection of your city walls. I know this is all metaphor, but I don't think you can get to that without using metaphor or using religious language, because if you just stick to sort of a very strict logic-based system of your own making, for the most part, you're not going to really know what's out there. It makes me think of the adventurer who goes out and has these great adventures and brings things back, and everyone's like, oh, wow, that's so cool. But they're not really interested in the actual adventure. They rather stay in their little safe walls in the reality that they know and understand. than to venture out but that's dangerous out there. You know, you're going to get things wrong. You might believe something is one way when it's actually not. And reality tends to tell you that. Am I being too metaphoric?
Well, that's the word I wanted to hone in on. I mean, it seems to me like the existence of metaphor proves something. Because if you have a worldview which is, well, I'm me and you're you, and I know me and you know you, and that's really all there is to it, then as humanity progresses, as time goes on, you would need metaphor less and less. And yet, as people get older, I think they need metaphor more and more.
Yeah.
Because you become aware of something that you can only access through metaphor. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis wrote a space trilogy, the first of which I think is called Out of the Silent Planet. It's a beautiful series of books. Highly recommend. But he makes the point in the book, and it's been long enough that I've read it that I can't give you the context of when this occurs in the book, but he makes the point that there are symbolic things, which is a similar thing to say that there are metaphorical things. There are symbols. There are symbolic things. And we know that there is meaning in those things, which means that there is something beyond our ability to comprehend, our ability to understand. And we know that's the case because those symbols retain meaning despite our best efforts at extracting it and articulating it, giving it names, giving it proofs. They remain symbolic. And there's no shortage of symbolic things in life, and even symbols and icons for that matter. But the fact that you simply you cannot go without it, metaphor, if you want to explain to somebody how you love them. People are not going to stop writing love songs. No one has figured it out yet. Right? And what do? We use metaphor. And we do it because I am not just me, and I'm not just a collection of information. I'm a person. I live and engage in the world relationally. And the truth is relational. The truth isn't factual. I mean, I think a question like, is God real? You know, it's like Christian versus atheist, let's say. I think that misframes the answer as something like a fact. And I don't think that if there is a God, that you can evaluate that truth on a factual basis. It has to be evaluated on a relational basis.
It's like I think I know where you're going with this, but I also want to kind of.
This is the first time that thought occurred to me, so I don't know if that made any sense.
Well, I love that you're heading this direction. I think because I would tend to agree with you, but as you were talking about it, I was like, but why? Like that sounds a little bit. It's relational, like how can you. Well, again, it's like you don't have any personal. We'll say, so you have a bunch of facts, and then we all sort of weave those facts into a story. Like, what are these facts telling me? You know, the facts in and of themselves don't tell me anything. That you have to then embed them in a story. Like, okay, hey, all these things mean this.
I think that's the point I'm making, which is to say that without your word, the story, which I'm going to replace with relationship.
Okay, gotcha.
Because a story is things interacting in relationship. And you're saying facts are meaningless unless they're engaged in a story. And I think, yes. Okay. We live a story. We live relationally. And if there's a God, then that only matters relationally. And so you either take a position that relates with God or you don't. To say whether or not, to try to establish the fact of God's existence is just as meaningless as a single fact in isolation, I think.
Or even if you talk about climate change, it doesn't really matter what you believe on this or how to what extent. That's not the part I'm getting into but say we see this fact that, Earth's temperature is rising by 1 degree every 3 decades. It doesn't matter what the actual thing is. Well, the only reason why that matters to you is what that means. It's in relation to you in your existence. Mm-hmm. To the Earth, it doesn't really matter. Yeah. It's going to be here way beyond our existence. Right. But it matters because it's embedded in the story, and you are or us are a part of that story. And so we're creating the story around that fact matters because of we want to continue to exist here on this planet.
Well, and even on a more local time scale, I think it matters to people, to the activists which take up climate change as their, primary issue. Mm-hmm. It matters to them because of the story that surrounds that and the character that they get to play in it. And that is, in some sense, a very small religious epic. There's the sort of virginal Mother Nature who is oppressed and ravaged by a mankind which is selfish and narcissistic. And it allows you to place yourself in the position of hero, savior, and there's a lot of power in that. Just even personally for your sort of mental well-being, that gives you a purpose, something to care about, something for which to move into the next day. I mean, that story
is very religious in that they are also like the prophet in a sense. It's like Jonah and with Nineveh. He's like, hey, repent, or you're going to go to. It's like your town's going to be demolished. Right. It's just a modern day sort of Nineveh almost kind of parallel. What however you want to take that, but I think I'm taking the story way out of. I would say the climate thing's a little bit more complex. I'm using it in a very simple.
Yeah, and I think the thing I'm trying to extract out of that is that for everybody involved in the climate change discussion, it is the story that matters there. It isn't the facts. And you can use those facts to tell quite a few different stories. And I think, okay, well, is that a depressing thing? You can take the facts and tell quite a few different stories. Okay, whatever's factually true about religion, maybe it doesn't matter. You're choosing to tell a certain story with it. And I am making the claim that truth is relational, not factual. So how do you evaluate one truth against the other? So like if you take something like climate change, how do I evaluate those who say, well, the story is essentially we're going to ruin Earth and we're all going to die. And that's one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is, the climate's probably changing, but it's probably not a big deal. And I think we're going to be okay. It's like, okay, those are two different stories, same set of facts. How do you evaluate which one is the better story? And I think in some sense, and you might do the same game between religions or religion and atheism, let's say. And maybe the answer to that is you evaluate the story based upon what part it's asking you to play. Is it asking you to play a part that calls you forward into the best version of yourself in love?
And into the future.
And, if I just take those two, I'll just take the climate change and religion and atheism. the one side saying we're all going to die, they're also saying, and so you must give me all of your money and you must stop doing all of these things that I tell you to stop doing, and you must elect me to office and give me all the power. Otherwise, you're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, does that call me forward into the best version of myself? No. I think on the other side of that debate, people are saying, yes, there's probably some issues and you need to be conscious and aware and innovative and creative and solve problems for the good of yourself and for those around you. And I think, well, that sounds more like that's calling me forward into being the best version of myself, as opposed to the other side. That feels a bit like slavery. And then if I look at religion and atheism, Christian religion at least, the Christian religion, it's sort of a searing rebuke on humanity, but then a very short story that says, yep, you're beyond saving by the law, and yet I've removed that obstacle. Go be who you are now. That does seem to call me forward into something better than I already am. Whereas atheism says, you are only who you feel inside. There is no transcendent future. It's every man for himself. I hear that story and I think, well, that's a lot to deal with. I feel kind of anxious about that. I feel lesser about that. I don't know how to pair that with the experiences I have, such as I get older and I need more metaphor. I feel like I can talk to myself. I feel like I can talk to my future self. I feel like I can talk to my past self. How do you explain that? At least it points at something which is much bigger than what I feel like is contained within my current present self. And what is bigger than me? There has to be something bigger than me. Otherwise, half of my experiences seem to be invalidated. So maybe that's in this sort of hypothesis that the truth is relational and not factual. So what do you do with it? You relate with it. And so how can you judge one story against another? Maybe that was what is that word? Heuristic.
Well, it's interesting too. You also see another element too, is that I think everybody can agree on what we understand today will not be. It's understandable today and it's useful, but 100 years from now, we will look back on ourselves today and say, "Oh, how cute."
So I don't think everyone would agree.
I mean, I would be really hard pressed because you look back 100 years, we would say that about those people 100 years ago. Those people 100 years before them would say the exact same thing. So I would say it's hubris that I would say that to anybody who said that, is like that you would not think of that if people 100 years from now will look back on us today and say that's cute.
I think that there is something going on in society and culture right now which actually thinks that it has arrived at the right answers. And they don't think that. I don't think that they think people in 100 years are going to look back and say, look back at our current policies and values and not think about them in the way that we think about bloodletting in medical practice.
Man, I totally think that way about a lot of our prescription drugs right now, that we'll look back and see, oh, wow, we're actually harming ourselves more than we were actually helping ourselves. Sorry, that was a little bit of a side note there.
Totally.
But there's an element of this too, because I don't want to be too hard on it, is that it's useful today. It's the best that we have. I think that's what we're always dealing with, is like, what is the best that I have today? And that's the part of story making. Is you even see this with the Israelites going through, from Genesis to Malachi. It's not that God said, "Hey, this is who I am." It's more of a revealing over thousands and thousands and thousands of years of this character, the God of the Hebrews. And so I think that's a really great example of even humanity in general, is that it's easy to look back and shame those who have come before us. But at the same time, we're existing in a world where we have enough information to make good decisions. But we also should have the humility to know that we're also lacking. And I think that's what makes good leaders is, I'm going to move forward in this direction with the information that I have. And this is my honest movement towards something, because I want what is good and what is better. And then, maybe it'll change in 5 or 6 years from now, and then you should be able to switch gears and move into that direction.
To make good decisions requires humility.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you know yourself, yet you don't know yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be humble to the fact that you're wrong about a lot of things, and maybe some of the things that you're right about, you're right in the wrong way.
True. Yeah.
And maybe you're as right as you can be, but 5 years from now, you realize that was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to face your decisions with humility.
Yeah.
And that is, to use a religious phrase, it's like you have to almost make your decisions with fear and trembling. What is it? Work out your faith with fear and trembling, which means, you should be afraid of what you don't know and don't understand. And you should be afraid of being wrong, but you shouldn't cower in fear, and you shouldn't freeze and not act. That isn't any good.
Yeah.
So you make decisions, walk forward in your trembling and with fear, because you are humble enough to admit, to confess to the unknown, submit to the unknown, as you said, sort of toward the beginning, and say, I'm going to dive in, and it's going to be dangerous, and I might get it wrong, I might get it right, I might get it as right as I can, and then that's still not enough. But acting is better than inaction.
Yeah, inaction is cowardice. Yeah, there's just no way around it. Is we have to make a decision. We have to move forward into the future, and to not do that is death. Basically, it's like you will die slowly, like just inside, if you don't move into the future with some sort of a confidence too. Is like because you're also saying is there is something to be known. I'm going to move into the future.
There is a future to move into.
And I'm going to make a decision, and I'm moving into that future, and I might be wrong. But you know what? I'd rather move into the future where I am wrong and I learn that I'm wrong so that I can make a better decision. And I think that's the courageous thing in life. And people that inspire me are those who make a decision, move into the future, and find out they're either wrong or they got a little bit right, or but they're course correcting into.
You learn something you didn't know, which is to also learn that there was something you didn't know, which is also to adopt a more proper position of humility.
Yeah,
and that will help you make better decisions. I love how so many of the themes of episode 2 with my dad, and then our conversation last week where we replayed some of those clips, and then this conversation tonight, they've been 3 very different conversations, but there's been sort of these like nodes of overlap where we're kind of hitting back on the same ideas from a different angle, and I think that's really beautiful. I think we ought to
We do it.
leave it there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great.
Was.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for coming out to the shores. This is super fun, and yeah, hope you got something out of it. I did. I'm a
you
winker.
winked.
It's hilarious. Even if inanimate objects, I'm like,
I did an accidental simultaneous left-right link. I don't know what that is. There we go. Cheers.
cheers.
Love you all out there. Thanks for listening.
While you're jumping. Yeah, it's hilarious.